Picture this: the year is 1215, and the air is thick with tension along the banks of the River Thames. King John, his face etched with frustration and defiance, reluctantly presses his royal seal into wax on a document that will change the course of history forever. The Magna Carta, Latin for Great Charter, is born not from triumph but from desperation, a forced compromise between a hated king and his rebellious barons. But here's the twist: this agreement, now celebrated as the cornerstone of modern democracy, was meant to last just 10 weeks. 10 weeks. How did a temporary truce, scribbled on parchment in a field at Runnymede, become one of the most enduring symbols of justice and freedom in the world? That's the mystery we're unraveling today. Behind the Magna Carta's lofty reputation lie secrets, surprises, and stories that defy the dusty textbooks. Did you know that nearly 2/3 of its original clauses were scrapped within a century? Or that it was nearly lost to history twice, first to papal annulment and later to a careless librarian who nearly destroyed it with a spilled ink pot? This document, revered as the birthright of liberty, was almost forgotten, buried under the weight of time until revolutionaries and reformers dusted it off and wielded it like a weapon against tyranny. So why does it still matter 8 centuries later? Because the Magna Carta isn't just a relic, it's a mirror. Its clauses on due process, fair taxation, and the idea that even kings aren't above the law echo in constitutions and courtrooms around the globe. From the American founding fathers to Nelson Mandela, its spirit has inspired those who dare to demand justice. But to truly understand its power, we need to peel back the layers, the betrayals, the myths, the sheer audacity of a few inked words that refuse to fade. Over the next 30 revelations, we'll journey from medieval battlefields to modern Supreme Courts, uncovering how a fragile piece of parchment became immortal. Ready to see history in a whole new light? Let's begin. The Magna Carta wasn't just written on any old parchment, it was etched onto sheepskin, a material so durable it survived 800 years of chaos. But why sheepskin? Imagine the process. Scribes soaked sheep hides in lime for days to loosen the hair, then stretched and scraped them thin as paper, creating a surface tough enough to withstand wear yet smooth enough for ink. Unlike fragile paper, which crumbles over time, sheepskin could bend, roll, and even survive moisture, making it the perfect choice for a document meant to last. And last it did. Of the 4 surviving original copies from 1215, 3 are still in remarkable condition. One even bears King John's seal, dangling defiantly from a strip of parchment like a stubborn thread of history. Here's something that might surprise you. These copies aren't identical. Each was handwritten separately, with slight variations in wording, like medieval versions of a draft saved at different stages. The scribes worked quickly, their quills scratching under the pressure of a kingdom on the brink of civil war. You can almost see the urgency in the ink, some letters smudged, others cramped together, as if the writers knew this wasn't just another royal decree. And they were right. Despite being drafted in a single frenzied session, these sheepskin pages outlived castles, wars, and empires, the real miracle. These documents almost didn't make it. One copy was nearly lost forever when an 18th century librarian, distracted or careless, tipped an inkwell over it. The stain remains today, a blot on history itself, proof of how close we came to losing a cornerstone of justice. Yet even damaged, the words beneath the ink still speak, a testament to the stubbornness of sheepskin and the unyielding ideas it carried. Next time you hear about the Magna Carta, remember, it wasn't just the words that changed the world. It was the skin of a sheep, scraped and stretched, that gave those words a fighting chance. That grand title we all know, Magna Carta, wasn't actually what the barons and King John called it back in 1215. The document's original name, scrawled in the formal Latin of the medieval elite, was Magna Carta Libertatum, the Great Charter of Liberties. The distinction might seem small, but it speaks volumes. That extra word, libertatum, was the heartbeat of the entire agreement, a bold declaration that this wasn't just another royal decree. It was about rights, about limits on power, about liberty. So how did those two syllables get lost to history? Blame the clerks and chroniclers. Medieval scribes, drowning in a sea of charters and treaties, were masters of shorthand. Just as we might shorten Supreme Court to SCOTUS today, they trimmed libertatum for efficiency. Over time, the nickname stuck, especially after later kings reissued simplified versions of the charter. By the 14th century, even official copies dropped the full title, cementing its shorter, snappier moniker. But here's the irony: that missing word held the essence of why the barons fought so fiercely. Naming conventions back then were anything but glamorous. Most legal documents bore dry, descriptive titles. Think Assize of Clarendon or Statute of Westminster, often just referencing the place they were signed. But Magna Carta Libertatum was different. The great wasn't just about size, it signaled importance, a rarity in an era when kings ruled by whim and charter. That was deliberate too. Charters were binding, permanent, unlike temporary provisions or ordinances. The barons wanted this to feel unshakable, even if King John hoped it would vanish like morning mist. Funny enough, the name's journey mirrors the document's own survival, condensed, adapted, but never diluted. Today, we say Magna Carta out of habit, but every time we do, we're honoring an 800-year-old game of telephone where the simplest version carried the weight of the original. Next time you hear those words, remember, what's missing is just as telling as what remains. Out of the dozens of original copies rushed to England's counties in 1215, only 4 survive today, each with its own dramatic tale of survival. Lincoln Cathedral guards one, its wax seal still clinging stubbornly to the parchment after 8 centuries of political storms and 2 world wars. Salisbury Cathedral's copy, hidden away in a medieval library, escaped Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries by sheer obscurity. Then there are the 2 at the British Library, one so pristine it might have been tucked away untouched for generations, while the other bears the scars of history, folds from being carried in a bishop's saddlebag, and that infamous ink stain from a librarian's blunder. Identifying these originals wasn't as simple as checking a signature. Historians became detectives, analyzing handwriting quirks the way a scribe looped their G's or dotted their I's, like forensic experts matching fingerprints. They studied the wear patterns on the parchment, the chemical makeup of the ink, even the way the wax seals fractured over time. One breakthrough came when researchers noticed tiny pinpricks along the edges of the Lincoln copy. Proof it had once been pinned to a church door, proclaimed for all to see before being rolled up and forgotten. Preservation today is a high-stakes science. The Salisbury copy rests in a climate-controlled vault, its exposure to light measured in seconds per year to prevent fading. At the British Library, conservators use microscopic tools to repair fragile ink without touching the parchment, a process as delicate as brain surgery. And then there's the irony: these documents, meant to be public proclamations, are now too precious to display openly for long. Their words echo through history, but their physical forms live in near darkness, shielded from the very people they were written to protect. The real miracle, despite fire, war, and human error, the core message of those 4 sheepskin pages remains unbroken. They've outlasted the castles that housed them, the kings who ignored them, and even the language they were written in. When you stand before one of these originals, you're not just looking at ink and parchment, you're witnessing a defiance of time itself. King John was no stranger to rebellion, but by 1214, his barons had reached a breaking point. The crown's coffers were drained from years of costly wars, particularly the disastrous campaign to reclaim Normandy, and John's solution was to squeeze his nobles dry. Scutage, a medieval tax meant to buy out military service, spiraled out of control. demanded 11 times in just 16 years. For barons already bleeding gold, the final insult came when John lost Normandy anyway, humiliating England's aristocracy and proving their sacrifices worthless. But taxes were just the spark. The barons seethed over John's capricious justice, his habit of imprisoning rivals without trial, or seizing lands on a whim. One Lord, William de Braos, fled to Ireland after refusing to hand over his sons as hostages. His family was later starved to death in Windsor Castle. Stories like these spread like wildfire, painting John not as a king but a tyrant. Even the church turned against him after he clashed with Pope Innocent III over who should appoint bishops, a feud so bitter it got England excommunicated for 6 years. By spring 1215, the barons weren't just complaining, they were arming. Under Robert Fitzwalter, a powerful earl who'd lost castles to John's paranoia, they formed a coalition dubbed the Army of God. They marched on London, exploiting John's weakened position after yet another failed military campaign. The city's gates swung open in sympathy, leaving the king cornered. Negotiations at Runnymede weren't a polite debate. They unfolded under the shadow of swords, with Fitzwalter's forces camped nearby, a silent threat. The Magna Carta's clauses read like a direct indictment of John's abuses: limits on scutage, guarantees against arbitrary imprisonment, even a provision banning fish weirs in the Thames, a nod to merchants crushed by royal monopolies. Every line was a barb aimed at the king's worst excesses. And though John would later beg the Pope to annul the charter, calling it coerced, the barons had already done something radical. They'd proven power could be negotiated, not just inherited. Hidden in the Magna Carta's dense Latin text lies a clause so radical it would make any absolute ruler sweat. Clause 61, the Security Clause. This wasn't just a gentle suggestion, it was a full-blown blueprint for rebellion. The barons, fresh from years of King John's broken promises, demanded something unprecedented: a council of 25 of their peers, empowered to seize royal castles, levy taxes, even overthrow the king himself if he violated the charter's terms. Imagine the audacity, a medieval version of impeachment written into law 800 years before modern constitutions. The mechanics were brutally simple. If just 4 barons on the council suspected a breach, they could demand redress from the king. If he ignored them for 40 days, the entire council could mobilize force against him, with the backing of the commune of all the land, a phrase some historians interpret as an early nod to popular uprising. This wasn't theoretical, it happened. Within months of Runnymede, John reneged, triggering the First Barons' War. The council's existence proved the charter wasn't just words, it had teeth. Yet this revolutionary idea was too hot to handle. Later reissues of the Magna Carta, under John's son Henry III and grandson Edward I, quietly scrapped Clause 61. Too destabilizing, too dangerous to the Crown's authority. But the principle that power must answer to collective oversight refused to die. You can see its ghost in England's 17th century Parliament, in America's constitutional checks and balances, even in modern watchdog agencies. What makes Clause 61 extraordinary isn't just its ambition, but its recognition of a timeless truth: laws mean nothing without enforcement. The barons didn't trust John to police himself, so they built a system where the governed could hold the governor accountable. Sound familiar? It should. The spirit of those 25 barons lives on every time a court strikes down an unjust law or voters oust a corrupt leader. The mechanism was medieval, but the idea was immortal. Pope Innocent III's quill might as well have been a dagger. When news of the Magna Carta reached Rome in the summer of 1215, the most powerful pope in centuries didn't just disapprove, he was incandescent with rage. Here was King John, a sworn vassal of the Church after his humiliating surrender of England to papal authority just 2 years earlier, now shackled by a document that challenged divine right itself. Innocent wasted no time. His bull of annulment, dated August 24th, didn't just cancel the charter, it shredded its very legitimacy. The language was blistering. He called the Magna Carta not only shameful and base but illegal and unjust, declaring it null and void by the authority of Almighty God. The theological reasoning was explosive. Medieval kings ruled by divine right, their authority flowing directly from God, a belief enshrined in coronation oaths and preached from every pulpit. For barons to impose terms on their anointed sovereign wasn't just rebellion, it was sacrilege. Innocent framed the charter as an assault on the cosmic order, a violation of biblical injunctions to fear God and honor the king. Worse still, the barons had coerced John under threat of violence, making the agreement not just sinful but legally invalid under canon law. The Pope's move wasn't merely political, it was a spiritual excommunication of the very idea that power could be negotiated. John, ever the opportunist, seized the lifeline. Within weeks of receiving the annulment, he rallied mercenaries and tore through baronial lands, burning crops and hanging rebels from castle walls. The First Barons' War exploded into full-scale carnage, with both sides committing atrocities that made Runnymede's diplomacy feel like a distant dream. But the Pope's intervention backfired spectacularly. By painting the conflict as holy war, innocent turned moderate barons into radicals. Men who'd once sought compromise now saw Rome as another tyrant to defy. Some even invited France's Prince Louis to claim the English throne, a treasonous gamble that nearly toppled the Plantagenet dynasty. The irony, Innocent's annulment made the Magna Carta immortal. By declaring it void, he underscored its revolutionary potential, proof that this wasn't just another land dispute, but a challenge to the very nature of power. Centuries later, reformers would cite the Pope's overreach as evidence that liberty couldn't rely on the goodwill of kings or popes. It needed parchment, seals, and the courage to hold the mighty to account. That papal bull, meant to bury the charter, became its most unintended advertisement. King John's death in 1216 might have buried the Magna Carta with him, but his 9-year-old son, Henry III, became its unlikely rescuer. With rebel barons still in open revolt and a French prince occupying London, Henry's advisors faced a crisis. Their solution: reissue the charter but with surgical edits. The 1216 version, stamped with the papal legate's seal instead of a boy king's, wasn't just a peace offering, it was propaganda. Whole sections vanished overnight, including that explosive security clause allowing barons to seize royal castles. The message was clear: this was a gentler Magna Carta, one that promised reconciliation without threatening the crown's survival. A year later, the document evolved again, this time with a name change. The 1217 reissue split into two separate charters, one addressing general liberties, now called Magna Carta alone, and another tackling forest laws, Carta de Foresta. The forests mattered more than you might think. Medieval kings claimed vast woodlands as hunting preserves where poaching a deer could mean losing a hand. Henry's advisors, desperate to placate minor landowners, rolled back these draconian rules, allowing peasants to gather firewood and graze pigs. It was a masterstroke, turning a baronial weapon into a tool for broader appeal. But the real transformation came in 1225. 18-year-old Henry, now ruling in his own right, didn't just reissue the charter, he rebranded it. Gone were the messy compromises of his minority. This version streamlined the text, dropping obsolete clauses about debts to Jewish moneylenders whose expulsion had begun and refining legal procedures. Most crucially, Henry declared this edition the definitive version, ordering it read aloud in county courts twice a year. With that stroke, the Magna Carta shifted from emergency truce to enduring law. What's fascinating isn't just what changed, it's what survived. Despite 3 revisions, core principles like due process and fair fines remained untouched. Each edit wasn't a retreat but a refinement, sanding down the document's rough edges until it could endure centuries. By 1225, the Magna Carta was no longer a baronial ultimatum. It had become the Crown's own promise, a brilliant pivot that turned rebellion into tradition. The parchment lived on, not because it was perfect, but because it learned to bend. Here's a persistent myth that needs untangling. The Magna Carta did not invent habeas corpus. That crucial legal protection, the right to challenge unlawful detention, wouldn't formally appear in English law for another 4 centuries. But don't dismiss the Charter's role too quickly. Buried in its text lies Clause 39, a revolutionary seed that would eventually grow into the modern concept of due process. The wording was specific: no free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. At first glance, this might sound like legalese, but it struck at the heart of King John's tyranny. Before Runnymede, the king could arrest barons on suspicion alone, holding them indefinitely without trial, a tactic he'd used to crush dissent. Clause 39 flipped that script, insisting punishment required lawful judgment. Notice the phrasing, by the law of the land. That vague term became a legal battering ram in later centuries, reinterpreted to mean trial by jury, access to evidence, and eventually habeas corpus itself. The confusion between the Magna Carta and habeas corpus stems from a centuries-long game of telephone. By the 1600s, English common law reformers like Sir Edward Coke deliberately blurred the lines, citing the Charter as ancient precedent for contemporary rights. When Parliament finally codified habeas corpus in 1679, politicians invoked the Magna Carta's spirit to lend their new statute historical weight. The truth, the 1215 document wasn't a detailed legal manual, it was a blunt instrument against arbitrary power, one later generations would sharpen into finer tools. What makes this misunderstanding fascinating is how it reveals the Magna Carta's true power, not as a static text but as a mirror for each era's ideals. Medieval barons couldn't have imagined modern courtroom procedures, but their demand for lawful process became a rallying cry for anyone fighting unchecked authority. Today, when a judge issues a writ of habeas corpus, they're channeling an 800-year-old refusal to let power operate in the shadows. The Magna Carta didn't create the right, but it lit the torch that would eventually illuminate it. Clause 11 of the Magna Carta might seem like a footnote until you realize it's one of history's earliest legal shields for women. No widow shall be compelled to marry so long as she wishes to live without a husband. It declares, adding she must also receive her rightful inheritance without any difficulty. In 1215, this wasn't just progressive, it was radical. Widows in medieval England were often treated like property, their lands and futures bartered by kings or greedy relatives. The crown had a vested interest. Remarrying a wealthy widow to a loyal knight strengthened royal control. But the barons, many with daughters or sisters trapped in these forced unions, saw it differently. Their rebellion wasn't just about taxes, it was about family. Take Elena of Aquitaine, the fiery queen who defied 2 kings. Decades before Runnymede, her first marriage to France's Louis VII ended in annulment, but she kept her vast lands, a rarity. When she promptly married Henry II of England, her territories doubled his empire overnight. Elena's autonomy was the exception, though. Most widows faced relentless pressure. King John himself orchestrated the remarriage of Isabel of Gloucester, his ex-wife, to a loyal earl, pocketing a hefty fee for the transaction. Clause 11 put a stop to such schemes, at least on paper. The loopholes, of course, were gaping. The clause only protected widows who could afford to refuse. Peasant women remained vulnerable, and, without any difficulty, often crumbled under bureaucratic delays. Yet the principle was groundbreaking. It acknowledged a woman's right to choose, however imperfectly. Centuries later, feminist reformers would point to this clause as a flicker of medieval enlightenment, a crack in the feudal system's rigid patriarchy. What's often overlooked is how personal this was for the barons. Many had watched John auction off their mothers' or sisters' widowhoods to fund his wars. By securing this clause, they weren't just curbing royal power, they were protecting their own legacies. A widow's inheritance, after all, often passed to her sons. In safeguarding her, they shielded the next generation's birthright. The Magna Carta's legacy isn't just in grand ideals. Sometimes it's in the quiet battles fought for dignity, one widow at a time. Clause 10 of the Magna Carta reveals a dark undercurrent in medieval England, one where the crown's financial desperation collided with rising anti-Semitism. If anyone dies owing money to Jews, it states, their debt shall not bear interest as long as the heir is underage. On the surface, this seems like protection for vulnerable families. But dig deeper, and you'll find a system rigged against England's Jewish community, scapegoated as both bankers and targets. Jewish moneylenders occupied a precarious niche in medieval society. Christian doctrine forbade charging interest among believers, labeling it the sin of usury. Yet kings needed loans to fund wars and construction, creating a loophole. Jews, excluded from guilds and landownership, were pushed into finance, then vilified for it. The crown exploited this ruthlessly. When a Jewish lender died, their assets reverted to the king, a policy that turned human lives into royal revenue streams. Clause 10's protection for heirs wasn't kindness. It ensured the crown, not Jewish families, profited from deferred interest. The hypocrisy was staggering. King John himself had imprisoned Jewish moneylenders, torturing them to seize their wealth, like the Bristol merchant forced to hand over 10,000 marks, a staggering sum, after having a tooth extracted daily. The Magna Carta's barons, furious over John's taxes, redirected that rage toward Jewish creditors, painting them as exploiters rather than acknowledging they were middlemen in a system the crown created. This clause's legacy is chilling. Within 80 years, Edward I would expel all Jews from England in 1290, confiscating their remaining assets. The Magna Carta's wording, though subtle, echoed the era's toxic stereotypes, portraying Jewish finance as predatory while ignoring the crown's role in fostering it. Yet there's a tragic irony here too. The very document celebrated as a foundation of justice contained seeds of persecution, a reminder that progress for some often came at the expense of others. The parchment's ideals were lofty, but its ink sometimes carried shadows. Clause 33 of the Magna Carta might sound oddly specific. All fish weirs shall be removed from the Thames and the Medway and throughout all England. But this wasn't just about clearing river debris. It was a flashpoint in a medieval battle over resources, pitting the crown's lucrative fishing monopolies against merchants and peasants struggling to feed their families. Fish weirs, those woven wooden traps staked along riverbanks, were more than tools. They were symbols of who controlled England's waterways and ultimately its dinner tables. Kings had long claimed exclusive rights to royal rivers, leasing fishing spots to wealthy nobles who turned them into profit centers. These weirs weren't small-scale. Some stretched hundreds of feet, funneling fish into narrow openings where they could be scooped up by the barrelful. For upstream villagers, this was catastrophic. The traps blocked migratory fish like salmon, decimating populations beyond the weirs and leaving smaller nets empty. Complaints piled up for decades, but under John's rule, enforcement was selective. If a lord paid handsomely for the privilege, his weirs stayed, no matter how many towns starved. The barons who drafted Clause 33 weren't environmentalists in the modern sense, but they understood balance. Many came from regions where fish were a dietary staple, not a luxury. Removing the weirs wasn't just about fairness, it was survival. The Thames Clause, in particular, struck at royal excess. London's fish markets were dominated by the crown's favoured merchants, who drove up prices while smaller boats languished. Freeing the rivers meant reviving a frayed food chain, both ecological and economic. What's revealing is how this clause echoes in today's environmental laws. Modern disputes over dams, fishing quotas, and water access follow the same pattern: power versus sustainability. The Magna Carta's solution was blunt, but its recognition that natural resources shouldn't be hoarded by the few remains startlingly relevant. 8 centuries later, the fight over who controls the rivers and who gets to eat what swims in them hasn't really ended, it's just gotten more complicated. The ink on the Magna Carta had barely dried in 1215 when its ideas began an 800-year journey, one that would eventually cross the Atlantic and echo in the halls of Philadelphia's Independence Hall. Fast forward to 1787, James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution, scribbled frantic notes during the Constitutional Convention, referencing clauses from the medieval charter as if they were legal blueprints. This wasn't nostalgia, it was deliberate. The framers didn't just admire the Magna Carta, they reverse-engineered it. Take Clause 39's promise that no free man could be punished except by the lawful judgment of his peers. Sound familiar? It's the DNA of the Fifth Amendment's guarantee of due process and the Sixth Amendment's right to a jury trial, but the connections run deeper. When the founders debated excessive fines, they invoked Clause 20 of the Magna Carta, which banned crushing penalties that could ruin a man's livelihood. Centuries later, that same principle would resurface in the Eighth Amendment's prohibition of excessive fines. Even the concept of federalism, dividing power between states and a central government, mirrored the Charter's balance between crown and barons. Madison's personal papers reveal the obsession. In his pre-convention research, he pored over English legal texts, annotating passages where jurists like Edward Coke had stretched the Magna Carta's vague phrases into shields against tyranny. Coke's interpretation of law of the land as requiring legislative approval for imprisonment became a rallying cry against British warrants, and later, the foundation for America's habeas corpus protections. The founders weren't just borrowing ideas, they were completing a revolution the barons had started but never finished. The most striking homage, the Ninth Amendment. Its language, the enumeration of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people, reads like a direct response to the Magna Carta's fate. The framers knew how easily rights could be whittled away by later kings or congresses, so they built a legal escape hatch, ensuring future generations could invoke unlisted freedoms just as English reformers had rediscovered buried clauses. In that single sentence, the past and future clasped hands. What makes this legacy extraordinary isn't just the textual parallels, it's the audacity of the translation. A feudal contract meant to protect aristocratic landholders became a manifesto for universal rights. The barons of Runnymede couldn't have imagined a constitutional republic, but their parchment proved that words, once set loose in the world, take on lives of their own. When Supreme Court justices cite the Magna Carta in rulings, they're not honoring a relic, they're tapping into an argument that refuses to end. Out of the Magna Carta's original 63 clauses, only 3 still hold legal force in England today, a fact that might seem shocking until you understand why the rest crumbled. The survivors numbered 1, 9, and 29 in modern legal texts aren't random relics, they're the bedrock principles that refuse to fade. Clause 1, often overlooked, guarantees the freedom of the English Church, a nod to the barons' alliance with clergy against King John's interference. While it reads like medieval politicking, its spirit lingers in modern separations of church and state. Clause 9 is where things get personal. It protects London and other towns' ancient liberties and customs, a safeguard against royal meddling in local governance. Picture this: medieval merchants, sick of kings arbitrarily raising taxes or seizing ports, demanded this tiny line as insurance. 8 centuries later, it still echoes in debates over municipal rights and local autonomy. But the real heavyweight is Clause 29, the legal equivalent of a survivalist. Its promise that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned, except by the lawful judgment of his peers, has been quoted in courtrooms from 17th century England to 21st century human rights tribunals. So why did the other clauses vanish? Some became obsolete, like bans on fish weirs or debts to Jewish moneylenders as society evolved. Others were too specific to feudal grievances, like clauses about widows' remarriage or royal forest boundaries. But the deeper truth, the repealed sections weren't failures, they were scaffolding. Once their ideas, fair fines, due process, limits on power were absorbed into broader laws, the original wording could retire. The three survivors endure not because they're frozen in time, but because they're elastic enough to stretch across ages, proving that the strongest legal ideas aren't those carved in stone, but those woven into the fabric of justice itself. Before the Magna Carta became legend, there was a forgotten rough draft discovered centuries later in a French archive and dubbed the Unknown Charter of Liberties. This fragile parchment, dating to early 1215, reveals just how desperate the barons were to reign in King John long before swords were drawn at Runnymede. Unlike the polished final version, this 11-clause precursor reads like a raw manifesto, blending old grievances with startling new demands. One passage stands out, a direct appeal to Henry I's coronation oath from 1100, where that Norman king had promised, though rarely delivered, fair taxes and just rule. The barons weren't inventing rights, they were resurrecting them, threading 8 decades of broken promises into a single damning indictment. What makes the Unknown Charter revolutionary isn't its content alone, but its sheer existence. Medieval kings didn't negotiate terms with subjects, they issued decrees. Yet here was a document drafted by nobles, presented to John as non-negotiable conditions for their loyalty. Clause 4, demanding the king stop seizing baronial lands without cause, would later evolve into the Magna Carta's due process protections. Even more radical was Clause 7, forbidding John from demanding military service abroad, a direct challenge to his disastrous wars in France. These weren't requests, they were ultimatums, proof the barons had shifted from pleading to strategizing. The draft's survival is a fluke of history. Sometime after Runnymede, a copy made its way to the Abbey of St. Denis near Paris, likely smuggled by an English clergyman seeking papal support. There it lay unnoticed until 1893, when a historian sorting through moldering manuscripts spotted its unique phrasing. The handwriting told the tale, swift, uneven strokes with ink blots suggesting haste, as if scribbled during tense midnight discussions. Some clauses are crossed out entirely, early demands too extreme even for the final rebellion. Most telling are the gaps. Unlike the Magna Carta's detailed legalisms, this version is blunt, even emotional. No clauses about fish weirs or widows' rights, just bare-knuckled demands to stop the bleeding. Historians now see it as a rallying cry, a prototype that forced John to the table. Without this scrappy first draft, there might never have been a Magna Carta at all. It's a reminder that revolutions rarely spring fully formed from the earth. They're built line by line, in backrooms and abbeys, by people brave enough to write down what power fears most. Lincoln Cathedral's copy of the Magna Carta had survived civil wars, religious upheavals, and 8 centuries of history, but nothing could have prepared it for its most unexpected journey, a transatlantic voyage to America in 1939. As fascism darkened Europe, the British government made an extraordinary decision. This fragile piece of parchment, one of only 4 originals, would travel to New York for the World's Fair, a bold loan meant to symbolize the endurance of democracy in the face of tyranny. The fair's theme was the world of tomorrow, and the Magna Carta became its star attraction. Displayed in a bulletproof case at the British Pavilion, it drew crowds who stood in hushed awe before the document that had inspired their own Bill of Rights. The irony was palpable, a medieval English charter now celebrated as a shared Anglo-American landmark, while the world teetered on the brink of war. But the real drama began after the fair closed. With Britain under bombardment in 1941, returning the parchment was unthinkable. Instead, it was secretly transported to Fort Knox, the same vault that safeguarded America's gold reserves, joining the Declaration of Independence and Constitution for safekeeping. Imagine the scene: soldiers standing guard over a sheepskin document in a high-security bunker, treated with the same vigilance as national treasures. The Magna Carta spent 4 years in Kentucky, its presence a silent rebuttal to Hitler's vision of a lawless new order. Only in 1945, with peace restored, did it return to Lincoln, where it remains today. This unlikely wartime journey reveals something profound. By sheltering the Magna Carta, America wasn't just protecting a relic, it was defending the idea that laws, not brute force, should govern nations. That sheepskin in Fort Knox became a quiet act of defiance, proving that some principles are worth locking away in vaults until the world is safe for them again. The image of King John dramatically signing the Magna Carta is burned into popular memory, but it's pure fiction. Medieval England didn't rely on signatures. Power was authenticated through wax and symbolism. John never touched a quill to that parchment at Runnymede. Instead, his royal seal, a lump of beeswax imprinted with his likeness, was pressed onto strips of parchment dangling from the document's bottom edge. These seals weren't just decorative, they were the medieval equivalent of a cryptographic signature, impossible to forge without access to the king's matrix, a metal stamp kept under heavy guard. Surviving copies of the Magna Carta reveal the artistry behind these seals. John's showed him enthroned, crown on head, scepter in one hand and orb in the other, a visual declaration that even in compromise his authority remained intact. The wax itself was a status symbol, often mixed with vermilion dye to create a rich red hue, while commoners used plain brown wax for their seals. But here's the twist: the original 1215 seals were attached with cords made of twisted silk, a luxury import that signaled this wasn't just any legal document. Why no signatures? In a world where literacy was rare even among nobles, seals bridged the gap. They were tactile, recognizable across language barriers, and carried legal weight. A king's seal could mobilize armies or drain treasuries, which is why losing one was catastrophic. Years before Runnymede, John's father, Henry II, had nearly lost his throne when rebels stole his seal to issue fraudulent orders. The lesson stuck: seals equaled control. The Magna Carta's authentication didn't stop there. Each copy dispatched to the counties was sealed not just by John, but by senior church officials, a dual guarantee blending royal and divine authority. Today, only one original seal survives, clinging stubbornly to the Lincoln copy, its edges chipped but its message clear. Legitimacy wasn't written, it was stamped. Modern signatures may dominate our contracts, but 8 centuries ago, trust literally hung by a thread. While the Magna Carta grabbed the spotlight, its lesser-known sibling, the Charter of the Forest, quietly reshaped daily life for ordinary English people in ways the Baron's document never could. Issued in 1217 by Henry III's regents, this companion charter tackled a different kind of tyranny: the Crown's stranglehold on England's vast woodlands. Royal forests weren't just patches of trees, they were militarized zones covering nearly a third of the country at their peak. Under Henry II and John, peasant families could be fined for gathering firewood, their livestock seized for grazing too close to a king's hunting ground, even their hands chopped off for poaching a single deer. The Forest Charter didn't just tweak these rules, it demolished them. For the first time, commoners gained legal access to royal woods for essentials like foraging and grazing. Clause 4 declared that every free man may adjust his wood in our forest. Medieval legalese meaning peasants could let their pigs root for acorns without fear of royal punishment. Clause 10 abolished the death penalty for taking venison, replacing it with a modest fine. But the most radical shift was geographic. The Charter forced the Crown to officially delineate forest boundaries, rolling back centuries of royal land grabs. Overnight, vast tracts reverted to common use, a medieval version of eminent domain in reverse. What made this charter revolutionary wasn't just its content, but its audience. While the Magna Carta primarily safeguarded barons and clergy, the Forest Charter spoke directly to villagers and smallholders, the people hardest hit by royal excess. It recognized their economic survival depended on access to nature's bounty, a concept startlingly modern in its ecological sensibility. For generations, forest law had been arbitrary and brutal, enforced by corrupt wardens who lined their pockets with trumped-up fines. Now, even the king's hunting privileges had limits. The two charters were meant to work in tandem. One curbed political power, the other economic predation. Yet history remembers them unevenly. The Forest Charter was reissued alongside the Magna Carta for decades until the two merged in 1297, its clauses absorbed into the larger document. But its legacy lingers in unexpected places, from modern debates over public land access to the right to roam movements across Europe. That forgotten parchment proved justice wasn't just about castles and crowns. Sometimes it grew among the trees. Shakespeare's King John is a play brimming with political intrigue, betrayal, and battlefield drama, yet there's one glaring absence. The Magna Carta, arguably the most defining moment of John's reign, never makes an appearance. This omission seems baffling at first. Here was a playwright who famously reshaped history to fit his narratives, compressing decades into acts and inventing scenes wholesale for dramatic effect. So why skip the very event that turned a failed king into a pivotal figure? The answer lies in Elizabethan politics and Shakespeare's knack for survival. By the 1590s, when the play was written, the Tudor monarchy had spent centuries consolidating power, often by portraying rebellious nobles as threats to stability. The Magna Carta, with its origins in baronial revolt, was a dangerous symbol to spotlight. Elizabeth I's government had even suppressed scholarly discussions of the Charter, wary of inspiring fresh challenges to royal authority. Shakespeare, no stranger to censorship, knew better than to glorify a document that enshrined the idea that subjects could dictate terms to their sovereign. Instead, he focused on John's conflict with the church and France's safer ground for a playwright walking the tightrope of court approval, but the silence speaks volumes. Shakespeare's John is a complex villain, petulant and paranoid, yet his downfall stems from personal failures rather than systemic revolt. The barons who forced the Magna Carta are reduced to faceless traitors, their motives unexplored. Contrast this with Henry V, where the king's legal claims to France are dissected in detail, or Richard Roman II, which wrestles openly with the divine right of kings. The Magna Carta's absence isn't an oversight, it's a deliberate erasure, a reminder that art often bends to the pressures of its time, yet there's a tantalizing hint of what might have been. In Act 5, as John's reign crumbles, a noble declares, "We will not rend the kingdom for a line." Some scholars hear echoes of Clause 12, which curbed the king's power to demand arbitrary taxes. Was Shakespeare nodding to Runnymede in code, knowing his audience would catch the reference? We'll never know. But the play's lasting irony is this. While Shakespeare ignored the Magna Carta, its legacy would eventually shape the very freedoms that let later writers celebrate it. The parchment outlasted the censors and even the bard himself. By the 19th century, the Magna Carta had faded into obscurity, just another dusty parchment in England's legal archives. Then came the Victorians, armed with nationalist fervor and a knack for rewriting history. Scholars like William Stubbs, whose Constitutional History of England became a bestseller in 1874, didn't just study the Charter, they resurrected it as a sacred relic of British exceptionalism. Stubbs, an Oxford professor with a flair for drama, recast Runnymede as the birthplace of parliamentary democracy, a narrative that conveniently aligned with Britain's soaring imperial ambitions. Suddenly, the Magna Carta wasn't just a feudal peace treaty, it was proof that Anglo-Saxon virtue had bestowed the gift of liberty upon the world. The timing was no accident. As the British Empire stretched across continents, politicians needed a founding myth to justify their civilizing mission. What better symbol than a document that, when selectively quoted, seemed to enshrine fair governance and rule of law? Stubbs and his contemporaries cherry-picked clauses, ignoring the Charter's messy origins to frame it as a deliberate blueprint for modern democracy. Prime Minister William Gladstone even brandished copies during debates over Irish Home Rule, arguing that the empire's greatness stemmed from its ancient respect for justice. Never mind that the original barons would have recoiled at the idea of sharing rights with colonized peoples. The Victorians smoothed over those contradictions with patriotic gloss. This revival wasn't confined to lecture halls. In 1857, the British Museum staged a grand exhibition featuring a Magna Carta manuscript, drawing crowds who treated it like a religious artifact. Artists depicted King John signing the Charter with saintly reverence, while children's textbooks spun it as a triumphant step toward progress. The irony was thick. A document born of rebellion became a tool for upholding the establishment. Even the physical copies got a makeover. Conservators trimmed frayed edges and rebound pages, literally polishing history to fit the Victorian ideal. What's fascinating isn't just the historical revisionism, it's how thoroughly it stuck. Stubbs' interpretation still shadows modern perceptions, proving that the Magna Carta's power lies not just in its words, but in the stories we tell about them. When later suffragettes and anti-colonial leaders invoked the Charter against the British state, they were wrestling with a myth the Victorians helped create. The past, it turns out, is always under construction. Winston Churchill stood before the House of Commons in August 1940, his voice thundering through a chamber still smelling of smoke from the Blitz. "We are fighting," he roared, "not for the domination of any race, but to restore the sovereignty of law, the very principle enshrined in Magna Carta." In that moment, 800 years after Runnymede, a medieval parchment became a weapon of war. Churchill didn't just reference the Magna Carta, he weaponized it, reframing Britain's struggle against Hitler as a defense of the same liberties King John's barons had clawed from tyranny. The propaganda machine seized on this symbolism with startling creativity. That same year, the British government shipped a copy of the Magna Carta to the United States, displaying it at the New York World's Fair next to the Declaration of Independence. The exhibit's brochure hammered the connection home: two documents, one spirit. Back in London, the Ministry of Information commissioned posters pairing the Charter's clauses with images of Spitfire squadrons and resilient Londoners, splicing medieval Latin with modern defiance. One striking leaflet showed a British soldier standing guard over the parchment's text, his silhouette superimposed over Clause 29's promise of due process, a not-so-subtle jab at Nazi arbitrary arrest. Archival newsreels from 1943 reveal even bolder stagecraft. In a ceremony at Lincoln Cathedral, where one original Magna Carta had been hidden in an underground vault to avoid Luftwaffe bombs, American and British troops gathered to hear readings from the document. The cameras zoomed in on a GI carefully turning the parchment's fragile pages, his uniform a stark contrast against the medieval script. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't just Britain's heritage under threat, it was civilization's. Churchill's genius lay in recognizing that symbols outlive the circumstances that create them. When he invoked the Magna Carta in radio broadcasts, he wasn't celebrating feudal barons, he was grafting 8 centuries of moral weight onto the Allied cause. The Nazis, he argued, weren't just enemies, they were the spiritual heirs of King John, trampling rights that had taken lifetimes to secure. It was history as psychological warfare, and it worked. By war's end, even German POWs questioned in secret Allied surveys cited the Magna Carta as proof some freedoms were worth dying for, the ultimate irony. The same document, once annulled by a pope, had become a rallying cry against a dictator who styled himself as Europe's new Holy Emperor. Churchill didn't just borrow the Magna Carta's prestige, he proved its ideas could outfight armies when wielded with enough conviction. Modern technology has given us eyes that can see what was once invisible even on parchment 800 years old. Multispectral imaging, originally developed for satellite photography and medical diagnostics, is now revolutionizing how we study the Magna Carta. This cutting-edge technique doesn't just photograph the document, it peels back layers of time. By capturing images under different wavelengths of light, from ultraviolet to infrared, researchers can reveal faded ink, erased annotations, even the ghostly outlines of words worn away by centuries of handling. One stunning discovery: on the Lincoln Cathedral copy, faint marginal notes were detected, likely scribbled by a medieval clerk cross-referencing the charter with other legal texts. These weren't just random marks, they were evidence of how the document was actually used, debated, and interpreted in real time by those who held it. But the tech goes deeper. Hyperspectral imaging, an even more advanced cousin to multispectral, can identify the chemical composition of inks without touching the parchment. This solved a long-standing mystery: why some clauses appear darker than others. Analysis revealed scribes used iron gall ink for critical passages, a blend of oak galls and iron salts that resisted fading, while less important sections got cheaper carbon-based inks, explaining their uneven survival. Even the parchment itself tells tales under this scrutiny. Variations in collagen density, visible through advanced scanning, show which sheets came from the same flock of sheep, helping trace how many scribes worked simultaneously to produce multiple copies in those frantic June days of 1215. The most poignant revelation came from the British Library's damaged copy. Under multispectral light, the infamous ink stain became a window, not a barrier. Hidden beneath the blot, researchers recovered the original wording of Clause 29, confirming that later restorations had accurately preserved its promise of due process. It's as if the stain, long seen as a symbol of neglect, became proof of resilience, the words surviving not despite the damage, but invisibly beneath it all along. These tools aren't just about preservation, they're changing how we understand the Magna Carta's very DNA. By mapping every fiber and pigment, scientists can predict which areas need stabilization before decay starts, ensuring this sheepskin manifesto lasts another 8 centuries. What began as a desperate truce now lives in terabytes as much as vellum, its digital twin allowing historians worldwide to scrutinize strokes of ink like never before. The past isn't just being protected, it's speaking louder. The tranquil meadows of Runnymede seem frozen in time, their peaceful expanse belying the drama that unfolded here 8 centuries ago. But just upstream lies a curious anomaly, a small teardrop-shaped island in the Thames, proudly dubbed Magna Carta Island since Victorian times. Local legend insists this was the actual signing spot, with one cottage owner even claiming his home stood on the precise stone where King John placed his seal. The story has all the makings of perfect tourist bait, except archaeology tells a very different tale. Excavations around both sites reveal telling clues. While the island boasts a picturesque 13th century chapel conveniently restored in the 1800s, no contemporary records mention it as the signing location. Contrast this with the Runnymede water meadows, where soil analysis uncovered evidence of large temporary encampments from the exact period, exactly what you'd expect when hundreds of armed barons and royal retinues needed space to face off. Even the logistics defy the island theory. Medieval negotiations of this scale required room for dozens of tents, horses, and scribes, not to mention space for the king to preserve at least the illusion of dignity. A cramped river island makes little sense compared to Runnymede's open grasslands, which had hosted royal assemblies for generations. So how did this myth take root? Blame 18th century antiquarians and their love of romantic symbolism. The island's isolation made it ideal for poetic reimagining, a solitary spot where liberty was born, far from the messy reality of armed standoffs. By 1834, when a wealthy merchant bought the island and erected a commemorative plaque, the legend had cemented into fact. Victorian engravers eagerly depicted John signing beneath an ancient oak on the island, despite zero evidence such a tree ever existed. Even today, some boat tours still repeat the tale, proving how stubbornly folklore clings to history's coattails. The irony is delicious. The real Runnymede site, now marked by a modest memorial, lacks the island's photogenic appeal but carries something far more valuable: the weight of truth. That open field witnessed not a solitary act of royal concession, but a hard-fought compromise between thousands of armed men. No quaint island, no legendary oak, just the unvarnished reality of power reluctantly yielding to collective will. Sometimes the true story needs no embellishment to endure. In the dusty outback of Western Australia, a group of protesters waving copies of the Magna Carta made headlines in 2021, not for commemorating history, but for attempting to invoke its 800-year-old clauses against modern vaccine mandates. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across Australia and other Commonwealth nations, activists have increasingly brandished the medieval charter as a legal shield against everything from lockdown orders to tax policies, testing whether a feudal document can still flex its muscles in 21st century courtrooms. The results: a fascinating collision of ancient text and contemporary justice that reveals just how elastic or fragile the Magna Carta's legacy truly is. Take the case of Reid v. Commissioner of Police in 2022, where a Queensland man argued that COVID restrictions violated Clause 29's guarantee of judgment by one's peers. The judge's response was blunt. The Magna Carta, while historically significant, had been superseded by centuries of statutory law. Yet the same year, in a surprising twist, New Zealand's High Court referenced Clause 40's promise that justice wouldn't be sold, delayed, or denied when ruling against bureaucratic delays in immigration hearings. These contradictory outcomes highlight a stark reality. The Charter's power depends less on its original words than on how modern legal systems choose to hear them. Aboriginal activists have wielded the Magna Carta differently, framing it as a tool for colonial reckoning. In the Mabo land rights cases, lawyers drew parallels between the Charter's protections against arbitrary seizure and the dispossession of indigenous lands, arguing that if medieval barons could demand restitution, so too could First Nations peoples. While judges ultimately grounded their rulings in common law rather than the Magna Carta, the symbolism resonated powerfully in public discourse, turning parchment into protest. Then there's the curious case of so-called Magna Carta freemen, a fringe movement that misinterprets the document as a loophole to evade taxes or traffic laws. Their courtroom theatrics, like the Melbourne man who demanded trial by 12 common law jurors, as stipulated in Clause 39, typically end in fines or bench warrants. Yet their persistence reveals something deeper, a hunger for historical legitimacy in an age of complex governance. What binds these cases is their shared belief that ink from 1215 still carries weight. Whether dismissed as misguided or embraced as visionary, these challenges force judges to confront an uncomfortable question: is the Magna Carta a living document or a museum piece? Each ruling becomes a referendum on how societies balance tradition with progress, proving that even when the parchment fades, the arguments it inspires never do. For the Magna Carta's 800th anniversary in 2015, historians and artists collaborated on a tribute as audacious as the original, a flawless 24-carat gold leaf replica. painstakingly crafted to mirror every stain, crease, and faded letter of the Lincoln Cathedral copy. This wasn't just a gilded novelty, it was a statement. Where the original sheepskin had survived through stubbornness, this golden Magna Carta gleamed with deliberate reverence, its surface reflecting light like a beacon across centuries. The project, funded by the charity Justice, took 18 months to complete. Master calligraphers worked under microscopes, applying gold leaf so thin it floated onto vellum like mist, while conservators ensured every ink blot and wrinkle matched the original's weathered character. The result, a document that looked 800 years old yet shimmered with the brilliance of contemporary homage. Symbolism dripped from every golden stroke. The choice of gold, a metal that never tarnishes, mirrored the Magna Carta's own resistance to erasure. Even the imperfections were reproduced with precision. The Lincoln copy's infamous ink stain, its frayed edges, even the waxy residue where seals once hung. These flaws weren't hidden, they were elevated, turning the document's scars into part of its grandeur. The replica's creators understood something profound. The Magna Carta's power lies not in its perfection, but in its persistence. By gilding its struggles, they underscored how ideas outlast the parchment that carries them. Exhibited in Parliament and later touring globally, the golden Magna Carta became more than an art piece, it sparked dialogue. Schoolchildren gasped at its radiance, while Supreme Court justices debated its modern relevance under its glow. One curator noted the irony: we made it precious so people would see it as precious. The original's survival had been accidental. This version's existence was a deliberate act of memory. Perhaps the most telling detail lies in the replica's final home. It resides not in a museum, but in Lincoln Castle's Victorian prison. There, behind bars meant to hold lawbreakers, the golden document gleams, a radiant counterpoint to the darkness of unchecked power. The message is unmistakable. Liberty is both fragile and unyielding, as worthy of celebration as it is of protection. Gold, after all, doesn't just adorn history, it preserves it. Durham Cathedral's library was burning. Flames licked at priceless manuscripts in the summer of 1745, swallowing centuries of history in acrid smoke. And according to a cryptic note in an archbishop's diary, something far more precious may have been lost. Nestled between accounts of stained glass repairs and choir expenses, the entry mentions a great charter of King John reduced to ashes. For modern historians, this offhand remark is a siren call. Could one of the original 1215 Magna Cartas, a document as rare as hen's teeth, have perished that night in the flames? The hunt for Durham's lost copy reads like a medieval mystery novel. Unlike the 4 surviving originals, whose provenance is meticulously documented, this one surfaces only in tantalizing fragments. A 1252 inventory lists a Magna Carta cum aliis Cartis in the cathedral's treasury, while 14th century monks' correspondence refers to consulting the Charter of Liberties during a dispute with local nobles. Then silence. By the time antiquarian James Raine combed through Durham's surviving archives in the 1830s, he found only a charred scrap of parchment too damaged to identify, though he swore its wax stains matched Plantagenet-era seals. Modern technology has reignited the search. In 2019, a team from Oxford University used spectral imaging to examine fire-damaged documents from Durham's collection, hoping to detect vanished ink beneath soot. Their breakthrough came when they identified a fragment with phrases like "per commune concilium rigni nostri," by the Common Council of our kingdom, language unique to the Magna Carta's early clauses. The handwriting, analyzed by paleographers, matched known scribes from John's reign. While not definitive proof, it's the strongest lead yet that Durham once guarded its own original. But the intrigue doesn't end there. Rumors persist of other missing copies, like the version supposedly stored at Canterbury Cathedral, mentioned in a chronicle as being displayed above the altar of St. Some scholars speculate it was destroyed during Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, while others whisper it was smuggled to France by fleeing monks. Then there's the York copy, last documented in 1323 when the city's archbishop cited it to challenge royal taxes. Its fate, possibly recycled as binding material for a later book, a common practice when parchment outlived its political urgency. What drives historians to keep searching isn't just academic obsession. Each lost copy represents a missing piece of the puzzle: how widely the charter was distributed, how differently regional scribes interpreted its clauses, even how ordinary people first encountered its radical ideas. Finding one would be like discovering a new draft of the Declaration of Independence, complete with marginal notes from those who resisted it. Until then, the ashes at Durham whisper a tantalizing possibility that somewhere, in some forgotten vault or disguised binding, a 9th century sheepskin still waits to tell its story. The fire might have taken the parchment, but the hunt for its secrets will never burn out. One of the most persistent myths about the Magna Carta is the idea that it declared no taxation without representation, a phrase that feels so perfectly aligned with its spirit that it's easy to believe it originated there. But here's the truth: those exact words appear nowhere in the 1215 document. The confusion stems from a centuries-long game of historical telephone, where later revolutionaries, particularly American colonists, retroactively grafted their own ideals onto the medieval charter. The actual clause about taxation, Clause 12, is far more limited, stating that no scutage or aid medieval taxes could be levied without the common council of our kingdom, meaning the barons, not the general populace. For peasants and merchants, this was hardly a democratic revolution. It was aristocracy flexing its muscle against the crown. So how did this misquote take root? Blame 18th century agitators like Samuel Adams, who invoked the Magna Carta as propaganda against British rule. By the 1760s, colonial pamphlets were freely paraphrasing the Charter's principles to suit their cause, collapsing 800 years of legal evolution into sound bites. The Boston Tea Party protesters didn't carry copies of Clause 12. They rallied around a simplified slogan that felt medieval but was thoroughly modern. Even today, politicians and pundits repeat the error, conflating the barons' narrow demand for consultation with a universal right to representation. Another common misattribution, the idea that the Magna Carta guaranteed trial by jury. While Clause 39 promises judgment by one's peers, medieval peers meant fellow nobles, not the 12-person juries we know today. The modern jury system took another 4 centuries to crystallize, yet courtroom murals and legal textbooks often depict King John's barons as proto-constitutionalists, foreshadowing practices they couldn't have imagined. The most ironic twist, many of these misquotes gained traction precisely because the Magna Carta's real clauses were too archaic for modern audiences. It's far easier to celebrate a sanitized version of history than to explain feudal tax disputes or forest laws. But every time we repeat these myths, we do something revealing. We reshape the past to mirror our present struggles, proving that the Magna Carta's greatest power isn't in its original words, but in our endless reinterpretation of them. Comic books and graphic novels might seem like unlikely places to encounter an 800-year-old legal document until you flip through the pages of Magna Carta. Our Shared Legacy, a stunning graphic novel released in 2015 to mark the Charter's octocentennial. Far from a dry history lesson, this vibrant adaptation reimagines Runnymede as a clash of titans, with King John and the barons rendered in bold, dynamic strokes that transform their feud into something resembling a medieval superhero showdown. The artist's choice of style is deliberate. Heavy shadows and dramatic angles lend the negotiations a sense of urgency, while the charter itself glows on the page, its text unfolding like a scroll of destiny. This isn't just illustration, it's visual rhetoric, framing the Magna Carta as the original underdog story, where ideals triumph over brute force. Pop culture's reinterpretations often take creative liberties, but they reveal something textbooks can't: how each generation molds the Magna Carta to reflect its own struggles. In the graphic novel, scenes of barons debating Clause 39 are intercut with modern courtroom dramas, drawing a direct line from medieval judgment by peers to contemporary jury trials. One striking panel superimposes a 21st century protester's right to justice sign over a baron's quill, collapsing 8 centuries into a single image. The message is clear: this isn't ancient history, it's a living argument. Even the lettering choices carry weight. The Charter's Latin phrases appear in jagged, Gothic fonts, while modern translations flow in clean, accessible bubbles, subtly reinforcing the idea that these principles have been translated across time as much as language. Other adaptations take bolder leaps. The Japanese role-playing game Magna Carta, Crimson Stigmata, transplants the Charter's spirit into a fantasy world where warring factions forge magical pacts to limit a tyrant's power. Proof that the core idea resonates even when stripped of historical specifics. Meanwhile, British political cartoons have long caricatured the document as a weapon wielded against modern overreach, from surveillance laws to Brexit disputes. In one memorable Punch cartoon from the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher is depicted as King John, grudgingly signing a Magna Carta for workers' rights under pressure from union leaders dressed as barons. The humor lands because the analogy feels instinctive, as if the Charter's DNA is hardwired into our collective understanding of resistance. What unites these wildly different interpretations is their shared emphasis on the Magna Carta as a symbol rather than a statute. The graphic novel's final pages drive this home with a montage of global movements, civil rights marches, women's suffrage protests, even digital privacy campaigns, each framed as chapters in the same ongoing story. The art invites readers to see themselves not just as inheritors of rights, but as potential barons at their own Runnymede, negotiating new terms for their times. By turning parchment into panels, these adaptations do something remarkable. They remind us that the Magna Carta's real power was never in its ink, but in its endless capacity to inspire. Clause 40 of the Magna Carta, with its resounding pledge that to no one will we sell, to no one will we deny or delay right or justice, might have been written for 13th century barons, but its echo can be heard in the cries of disability, rights activists scaling the steps of Capitol Hill or chaining themselves to buses in protest. Fast forward to 2022, when British campaigners unveiled the Magna Carta for disabled people, a modern manifesto demanding equal access, dignity, and autonomy. The parallels aren't accidental. Both documents tackle the same core injustice: systems that treat basic rights as privileges doled out at the whim of those in power. Consider the case of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Before its passage, wheelchair users faced public spaces designed as obstacle courses, while deaf patients had no guarantee of sign language interpreters in hospitals. The Ada architects didn't cite Clause 40 directly, but its spirit was undeniable. Justice delayed, whether by physical barriers or bureaucratic red tape, is justice denied. When activists like Judy Heumann staged sit-ins to force enforcement, they were channeling the same urgency as the barons who cornered King John at Runnymede. Both movements recognized that laws mean little without mechanisms to hold power accountable. Yet the fight is far from over. In India, where less than 1% of public buildings are fully accessible, disability rights groups invoke the Magna Carta's legacy to challenge glacial court delays on accessibility cases. A 2023 ruling in Delhi quoted Clause 40 verbatim, arguing that forcing disabled plaintiffs to wait years for ramps or braille ballots violated the timely justice principle etched in medieval parchment. Meanwhile, Japan's Barrier-Free Act revisions in 2021 faced fierce pushback from corporations until protesters brandished scrolls bearing the Magna Carta's Latin text outside Tokyo's legislature, a visceral reminder that exclusion isn't just illegal, it's ancient history repeating. The boldest reinterpretation came from the United Nations. Their Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, ratified by 182 nations, reframes Clause 40 for the digital age. Justice now includes the right to accessible websites, voice-to-text technology, and fair employment algorithms. When Argentina's blind lawyers sued over inaccessible court filings in 2019, the judge ruled in their favor by citing both the UN treaty and, in a startling nod to the past, the Magna Carta's ban on delayed justice. The message, disability rights aren't charitable concessions, they're the unfinished work of 800 years of legal evolution. What makes this connection more than symbolic is the shared tactic of making injustice visible. Just as the barons forced John to acknowledge his abuses by putting them in writing, disability activists use die-ins and viral videos to expose barriers the able-bodied world often overlooks. The British Magna Carta for disabled people even mimics the original structure, with clauses on education, healthcare, and employment replacing feudal grievances about fish weirs and widows' rights. Its architects knowingly borrowed the parchment's moral weight, proving that some fights, whether against a tyrannical king or an indifferent bureaucracy, require both a hammer and a mirror. The lesson here isn't just about legal continuity, it's about language's power to transcend time. When a blind student in Kenya invokes Clause 40 to demand Braille textbooks, or when autistic advocates in Iceland cite it to challenge institutionalization, they're doing more than quoting history, they're rewriting it. The Magna Carta's greatest legacy might be this: it taught us that rights aren't gifts granted by the powerful, but promises wrested from them one stubborn clause at a time. Modern technology has peeled back the centuries to give us something medieval chroniclers never could: a living, breathing vision of Runnymede in 1215. Historians and computer scientists have joined forces to reconstruct the Magna Carta's signing through artificial intelligence, blending archaeology, climatology, and biometric data to simulate the event with startling intimacy. Picture this: generative AI trained on 1,000-page tax rolls and property records now renders the faces of individual barons, their scars from French wars, the cut of their imported Flemish cloaks, even the way sunlight glanced off King John's crown as he grudgingly affixed his seal. These aren't generic medieval avatars, they're digital twins built from skeletal remains, heraldic manuscripts, and the meticulous expense accounts of royal stewards who logged every pound of wax and vellum purchased for the occasion. One groundbreaking model from Cambridge University even simulates the negotiations in real time, using behavioral data from chronicles to animate the baron's body language. Cross-referencing eyewitness accounts with voice stress analysis techniques adapted from forensic linguistics, the AI suggests Robert Fitzwalter, leader of the rebel faction, spoke through clenched teeth when demanding Clause 39, while John's infamous temper flared most violently over restrictions on royal forest rights. The landscape itself comes alive through LiDAR scans of the Thames Valley, revealing how June rains had left the meadows damp underfoot, a detail that explains why multiple chronicles mention nobles dismounting to avoid muddying their robes. Even the parchment's journey is tracked, with logistics algorithms mapping how riders would have fanned out to deliver copies to cathedral cities, accounting for 1215 road conditions and known bandit hotspots. The most haunting reconstruction, a soundscape simulation that layers together period-accurate weapon clatter, horse-tack jingles, and the murmur of clerks dictating clauses in Anglo-Norman French. By analyzing vowel shifts in Middle English poetry, linguists approximated how John's infamous retort, "Why do these barons not ask for my kingdom?" might have actually sounded. These digital tools don't just show us history, they force us to confront its humanity. When an AI extrapolates the fatigue in a scribe's handwriting as night fell on June 15th, or renders the flicker of torchlight on wet ink, the Magna Carta stops being a monument and becomes a moment frail, urgent, and alive with the same fears and hopes that shape justice today. Critics argue no algorithm can capture the bargaining table's tension, but perhaps that's missing the point. These reconstructions thrive in the gaps, using probabilistic modeling to spotlight what documents omit. One simulation suggests a third of the barons present couldn't read Latin, relying on whispered translations, a nuance that reshapes our understanding of medieval power literacy. Another reveals how the meadow's topography funneled voices toward John's tent, making secrecy impossible. The AI becomes less a time machine than a forensic tool, exposing how geography, acoustics, and even weather conspired to make Runnymede the perfect pressure cooker for compromise. What emerges isn't a polished myth, but a messy, visceral struggle exactly as it likely unfolded. Digital John sweats under his ceremonial robes. Virtual barons fidget with sword hilts while clerks sweat over misspelled clauses. The parchment itself wrinkles in simulated humidity. By rendering the event's imperfections, these models achieve something profound. They return the Magna Carta to the realm of human choices, reminding us that history's turning points aren't carved in stone, but etched by quills trembling in exhausted hands. As we rocket into the 21st century, the Magna Carta's DNA is mutating in ways its ink-stained scribes could never have imagined, finding new life in debates over artificial intelligence and the governance of interplanetary colonies. Legal scholars from Oxford to Silicon Valley are now asking, can a medieval charter drafted for sheep pastures and feudal taxes provide ethical guardrails for autonomous drones or Martian settlements? The answer, surprisingly, is gaining traction. When the European Parliament drafted its Artificial Intelligence Act in 2021, Clause 63 explicitly referenced the Magna Carta's principle of lawful judgment as foundational for algorithmic accountability. The connection isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. Just as Clause 39 demanded human oversight for punishment 800 years ago, modern jurists argue AI systems must preserve a human-in-the-loop for consequential decisions, whether denying loans or deploying facial recognition. Space law experts are mining the Charter's text even more creatively. Professor Charles Stotler of the Outer Space Policy Institute points to Clause 23's ban on diverting streams as precedent for regulating asteroid mining. If 12th century barons understood natural resources shouldn't be monopolized, why wouldn't that apply to lunar water ice? Private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin now face pressure to adopt voluntary Magna Carta for space principles, ensuring celestial commons remain accessible. One proposed Mars colony constitution even includes a solar system twist on Clause 40. To no being human or synthetic shall we sell, deny, or delay the right to breathable air. The Charter's true power, argues cyber law pioneer Dr. Priya Varma, lies in its strategic vagueness. Its phrases like law of the land and just penalties act like legal stem cells, adaptable to context from data privacy to genetic engineering. When South Korea's Supreme Court ruled in 2023 that AI-generated art couldn't be copyrighted without human input, the majority opinion quoted Magna Carta's judgment of peers clause as spiritual precedent. Meanwhile, blockchain developers are embedding snippets of its Latin text into smart contracts as symbolic checks against autonomous systems overriding human rights. But the boldest reinvention comes from futurists like Dr. Elijah Mensa, who envisions the Magna Carta as a Rosetta Stone for interspecies jurisprudence. When we encounter alien civilizations or create conscious machines, we'll need fundamental principles transcending earthly legal codes, he argues. His team's Galactic Magna Carta draft extends Clause 29's protections to any sapient entity, whether born of carbon or silicon. The parchment that once tamed a king may yet become the blueprint for cosmic rule of law, proving that some ideas don't just endure, they evolve beyond their creators' wildest dreams. From sheepskin that outlasted empires to a wartime journey that saw this medieval document guarded alongside America's gold reserves, the Magna Carta story is anything but predictable. Who could have imagined a treaty forced upon a king in a riverside meadow would become a beacon for democracy, smuggled into bunkers and brandished in courtrooms 8 centuries later? Its survival alone defies logic penned in haste, nearly destroyed by fire and ink spills, then resurrected by reformers who saw in its fading words a blueprint for justice. The same parchment that once dictated fish-weir regulations now inspires debates about artificial intelligence and space colonization, proving that great ideas refuse to be shackled by their origins. Think of the ironies. Clauses drafted to protect aristocratic privileges became foundations for universal rights, while passages targeting Jewish moneylenders reveal how even groundbreaking documents carry the stains of their time. The Magna Carta wasn't perfect, it was human, and perhaps that's why it endures. Its power lies not in lofty ideals alone, but in its sheer stubbornness to survive, adapt, and challenge each generation to ask who gets to wield power and who gets to hold them accountable. Now it's your turn. Which revelation left you breathless? Was it the discovery of lost copies hidden in abbey vaults, or the AI reconstructions that let us hear King John's grudging concession in simulated echoes? Drop your favorite insight in the comments. We're all part of this conversation. And if you're craving more, take a virtual stroll through Runnymede's meadows today. Stand where barons stood, where ink met parchment, and where an idea began its relentless march through history. The past isn't finished speaking. Will you listen?